Hello, this is Tom Davis and welcome back to part 2 of the World War II story of George Davis. In November 1942, George Davis was packed into overcrowded railway cars along with over 1,200 of his comrades, and they began their 1,000-mile journey up the Malay Peninsula, arriving at Nong Pla Duk prisoner of war camp on the 24th of December 1942. To begin working on the infamous Burma-Thai Railway. Life on the railway crews was very hard. Prisoners were forced to work for 10 to 16 hours per day in all weather conditions. Prisoners were assigned work which consisted mostly of physical labour, such as carrying raw materials, loading, unloading, construction work, track laying, bridge building and mining. The Japanese guards were very intolerant of any breach of rules or perceived lack of work effort, and used many types of physical punishment. Some prisoners were made to hold a heavy stone above their heads for many hours. Others might be forced into small cells without food or water for days at a time. Punishments were severe and included punching, slapping, and beatings were meted out with a sword scabbard or the butt of a rifle. Sometimes POWs were forced to keep running on the spot or to stand at attention for hours at a time, or were given the water treatment, which was where water from a water hose was run continuously over the prisoner's face. The average prisoner received less than a cup of rice a day. Some meat, fish and vegetables were also sometimes given, but these were always in small quantities and of poor quality. The amount was so meagre that gross malnutrition led to loss of vision and unrelenting nerve pain in many prisoners. Diseases were rife. Malaria and dysentery were almost universal. Dysentery, which is an infectious disease of the lower bowel, reduced men to living skeletons. Tropical ulcers were also common and particularly gruesome. One crucial means of survival in the camps was to form strong bonds with fellow prisoners. Indeed, close friendships were a lifeline in Japanese captivity. Having a small group of 3 or 4 mates were essential. They shared their food, shared their workload, and nursed each other when they were sick. Across individual camps, POWs pooled their skills and trades to help one another. Allied prisoners tried to stave off disease by constructing spotless kitchens and latrines using bamboo pipes which brought in cholera-free water from springs miles away, and cremating the dead in funeral pyres so that they wouldn't endanger the living. The prisoners carried out these tasks after torturous work shifts, during time they could have spent sleeping. However, despite their best efforts, many POWs died of malaria, dysentery, cholera or starvation. The reasons for the Japanese behaving as they did were complex. The Imperial Japanese Army indoctrinated its soldiers to believe that surrender was dishonourable. Therefore POWs were taught to be unworthy of respect. But discipline in the Japanese forces was also severe, and beatings were commonplace by Japanese officers to their own enlisted men. As the railway stretched north through the country, POWs were moved from camp to camp following the construction of sections of the railway. George Davis was moved from Nong Pla Duk prisoner of war camp to Kamburi camp on the 31st of January 1943, where he spent the bulk of his captivity. On the 15th of September 1944, he was moved to Tam Yong camp, and then on the 25th of September 1944, he was moved to Tan Yam Yo camp. His final move was to Nakhon Pathom, a hospital camp, on the 10th of January 1945, which means that George's health had seriously deteriorated at this point. This photo was actually taken inside Kamburi camp and gives some idea of the living conditions. George may very well be one of these men. This is the Japanese camp record from Nakhon Pathom, giving George's personal details. It is interesting to note that on the card The Japanese have stamped the nationality as English, but actually written above that he is Irish. The death rate among Japanese prisoners of war was 27%, compared to 4% for Allied prisoners held in German and Italian prisoner of war camps. As many as a quarter of the prisoners died. Indeed, more men died as prisoners of war than fell in action in the Far East. However, over 37,500 British servicemen who had initially been taken into captivity by the Japanese lived to see VJ Day. The Japanese surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, and the official surrender document was signed on the 2nd of September 1945. Following the official surrender on the 15th of August 1945, camp was surrendered to the Allied camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel A.C. Coates. George Davis left Nakhon Pathom camp on the 4th of September 1945, having spent 1,276 days as a Japanese prisoner of war. That's 3 years, 6 months and 20 days. This is a copy of his actual liberation interview sheet, which he filled in to provide details of his captivity. The British POWs sailed the 10,000 miles back to Britain, disembarking in either Liverpool or Southampton, more than 5 months after the war in Europe had ended. It is a remarkable story of how they overcame appalling adversity during the war, and how, having survived, they had to do so again in peacetime, because they were haunted by the horrors they had endured. Rather than feeling jubilant, returning ex-POWs were filled with shame and guilt at having surrendered and for having survived. These feelings of guilt were compounded by a difficulty in telling people about what they had been through. The purpose of this video is to honour the life of George Davis, and not to explain the long-term effects experienced by ex-prisoners of war. However, if anyone wants to understand more about the camps and the full effects on the POWs, I would highly recommend that you watch a movie entitled The Railway Man, which is the real-life story of Eric Lomax, who actually worked on the Burma-Thai Railway in the same camp as George. I would also recommend an excellent book entitled Kinkaseki, written by Arthur Teddington, who was taken prisoner in Singapore along with George Davis and was imprisoned in the notorious Kinkaseki mining camp in Taiwan. It is impossible for any of us in modern society to know the physical and psychological effects of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, but it is perhaps best summed up by a quote from Arthur Teddington's book. "The scars on my body have healed, but there remain scars that I am unable to show. 20 years old when the Japanese took me prisoner, I spent my 21st birthday working in the copper mines at Kinkaseki. Almost 4 years of irrecoverable youth were left in the depths of that mine. I do not forget, I do not forgive." Following his return to England, George resumed his life with Emily in St. Albans, and they had one son, Michael J. Davis, born in 1946. In the mid-1970s, George did come back to Ireland with his wife Emily and some of his grandchildren, and visited my parents' home in Dublin. This is a photo I took myself on that occasion, showing Emily and George with their grandson Russell. This second photo shows from left to right my Uncle John Davis, my Aunt Emmy Davis, George Davis, and my father Tommy Davis. I remember George as a quiet, gentle and gracious man who, to my knowledge, never discussed his wartime experiences. George Davis passed away on September 1977, aged 59, in St. Albans. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for watching another story from the Davis Family History video series. Goodbye for now. Slán leat.